Hey there, guys. Alright, today we are back with some more of the Great War, and this time, Prelude to Verdun and the Road to the Somme. Great War, Week 76. Before we dive in, though, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love it if you join the Discord and follow me over at Twitch. Alright, things are about to get exciting and depressing. Well, this whole war has been depressing. That's kind of the whole shtick of World War. Well, that's kind of the whole shtick of war. Kind of depressing. Anyway, let's just go ahead and fucking God, I'm stupid. Anyway, let's dive in.
For a month, a British army has been under siege on the Tigris River at Kut al-Amara, awaiting
It's already been a month for them? Fuck.
relief. And this week, that relief exhibition encounters the enemy. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. 1915 had ended with the beginning of a Russian offensive in East Galicia and Bessarabia, though it was plagued by supply problems and saw troops nearly starving in the winter cold.
What's Romania doing in all this? Are they neutral or are they in the war? And whose side are they on?
Austria-Hungary was calling up close to 1 million middle-aged men to join the fight against both Russia and Italy. Morale in Italy was at an all-time low, and over on the Western Front, it was mostly quiet as the Germans beefed up their defenses and the Allies made big offensive plans for later in the new year. Compared to the months of October and November, late December and early January were pretty quiet in the field, but there was action, particularly on the Eastern Front. On New Year's Day, the Russians attacked on both the Stripa and Styr rivers, and there would be scattered attacks throughout the week, with a lot of casualties on both sides, but without any appreciable gain in territory. Indeed, on the 7th, the Russians stormed Chartorisk, with the result that 11,500 of them were cut down by German machine guns. This was all part of a big move by General Ivanov on a 400-kilometer front from the Pripyat marshes to the Romanian border. One source says this was to give the Allies time to consolidate forces at Salonika. And in the far north, the Russians were
Did the Allies consolidate their forces at Salonika?
trying to push the Germans out of their positions between Riga and Dvinsk, and they were being clever. Constant local attacks deprived the Germans of the winter rest that Field Marshal von Hindenburg had promised them. On the Western Front, the action was much smaller, and people were still reeling from the huge offensives of last autumn. The first few days of the year saw artillery fighting in Belgium on the Yser and near Merken. The British tried a night attack near Vellingen, which failed. German artillery blasted Ypres and Loos, and a long-range gun fired into Nancy, killing a couple of civilians. And in the Vosges, it was a week of artillery duels between the French and the Germans.
Look at all those big guns.
It was basically
They got a lot of big guns.
business as usual. But there were big plans afoot, as I briefly mentioned last week. Although 1915 had certainly looked, on paper, like a far better year for the Central Powers than the Allies, the new year was in many ways looking up for the Allies. The Russians were overcoming their munitions crisis. The British were producing a land army, and they were also financing tons of imports, which were pretty much essential to the Allied war effort. Much of that from the neutral United States of America. As
Totally neutral USA. 100%.
1916 dawned, the British now had 38 infantry divisions, over 1 million men, and were ever expanding. France was still, as it had been the entire war, the dominant ally on land, with 96 divisions under General Joseph Joffre. And you couldn't deny that France had borne the brunt of the war on the Western Front. The battles that the British had been heavily involved in, like Loos or Neuve-Chapelle, were really only skirmishes when compared to the gargantuan French battles like Champagne and Artois. But the time was finally coming for a huge combined Anglo-French offensive in the West, to be complemented with simultaneous Italian and Russian offensives in the South and the East. As I said last week, French General Joseph Joffre had decided that it would be near the River Somme. Also last week, I spoke about the new German defenses on the Western Front, but they too had big offensive plans. German Army Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn could pretty much see that time was the one thing that was not on Germany's side. He also felt that Britain was his main enemy, but he couldn't get to them until he disposed of Britain's shield, the French army. What to do about that? Well, Germany had the advantage in munitions production. And since artillery, used properly, caused 75% of all casualties, and since German artillery was substantially superior to French, that's what he was going to use. Tons and tons and tons of German artillery. And he was going to use it somewhere where he figured the French would just have to stay and be battered, somewhere they would not retreat from. Falkenhayn's choice for that place was Verdun.
Never heard of it.
A historic place, a fortress commanding the heights of the Meuse River east of Paris, with a huge part in the mythology and history of France. He thought the French would have no choice but to defend it, and he would shell them to pieces. This did, in some ways, make sense, even though in pre-war France, Verdun had been just about the strongest part of its defenses. But now, it jutted out in a salient and was at least semi-open to attack from three sides, and from the German salient further south at Saint-Mihiel, Verdun's communications could be shelled. And if Falkenhayn's forces could take the heights east of the river, Verdun itself could be shelled. The German communications there were better than those of the French, who had a single uphill winding road. The Germans had air superiority, and a winter attack would also give a big advantage of surprise. Falkenhayn planned to bleed the French army to death at Verdun. Yep, total attrition. The French positions there were actually unprepared. It had been quiet there, and Joffre had even weakened defenses there a lot after the war began. Funny enough, there was an inspection there in January 1916, and after that, the French generals would have likely abandoned the position. But French politicians said that the glory of France forbade withdrawal from Verdun. The German force was to be the Fifth Army under the command of Crown Prince Wilhelm, but he would only have 9 divisions of men. Remember, this was all about artillery, and it would be sent to the front on 1,300 munitions trains over 7 weeks. The date when the attack would begin was planned for next month, February 12th. Oddly enough, other Germans in the German High Command felt differently than Falkenhayn. The chief of the German Navy General Staff, Admiral Henning von Holtzendorf, not to be confused with Austrian Konrad von Hotzendorf, he believed that his U-boats could knock Britain out of the war within the year. And later this month, the new commander-in-chief of the Imperial High Seas Fleet, Admiral Reinhard Scheer, stated that he believed he could bring the British fleet into the North Sea and he could beat it, opening the way to the British Isles.
I mean, the German and British fleet were, I'm rusty on the details. They were relatively close in strength, at least at the beginning of the war. 2 years, almost 2 years on though, year and a half on, British have the leg up, and they certainly still had the leg up at the beginning. It was more equal at the beginning. By now, the British, like how the kind of somewhat similar to Russia, the United States and Japan in World War II, the situation here between Britain and Germany is that Germany had an impressive fleet and some rather good admirals, just like the Japanese. However, the British kind of also have the same, and they have the ability to rebuild those ships should they get destroyed. Obviously, the British capabilities at this time is not as as overwhelming as what the United States could do in World War II, but like in terms of comparisons, it's the closest comparison that I got. The British had the ability to, for the most part, fix their ships should they get destroyed, replace them, and the Germans really did not.
But that was in the future, and in the present, the British were seeing action far from the North Sea in Mesopotamia. This week saw the Battle of Sheikh Saad on the Tigris River. Now, Charles Townshend's forces were under siege in Kut, right? The Ottomans had decided to starve them out after several offensive operations failed, and Lieutenant General Fenton Aylmer was heading upriver trying to relieve them. The winter rains and mud had rolled in though, and George Younghusband, which is a fantastic name, George Younghusband, leader of the advance team, had this to say: having no cavalry or aeroplanes, and the country being flat as a billiard table, the only way of reconnoitering the Ottomans was to march on till we bumped into them. Which they did on the 6th. Younghusband's attacks that day failed, but the next day, Aylmer and the cavalry had caught up with them. The attacks that day began in a heavy fog, and by the end of the day, British and Indian forces had taken the right bank of the river and could flank the left bank. The Ottomans were forced to retreat upriver. Thing is, though this was a victory, it was a real costly one for the British. 4,500 dead and wounded out of a force of 13,000. And they were far from their base at Basra and could not easily be replaced. And of course, each advance took them closer to the Ottoman base at Baghdad.
Which front would you guys want to fight on? I'm certainly not picking the Western Front. Certainly not picking the Eastern Front, so Europe's out of the picture. I'm not fighting on any of the fronts in Europe. I would not fight in the African colonies. That's a no-no. Really, that leaves the Middle Eastern campaign. I would probably fight on the Middle Eastern. That seems like, that most likely gives me the best chance at survival and the least bad conditions. Still awful conditions, but they seem like the least bad. I feel like maybe that the Middle East would also be the place where I would get the least traumatized from war. I'd probably go to the Middle East and probably want to serve there if I had to fight the Ottomans instead of fucking Germans, or if I had a choice.
And that was the week. Battles in Mesopotamia and on the Eastern Front, and scattered action in the West as the Germans prepare for a huge winter offensive. But think about that offensive. The plan was to basically be last man standing. That's what they were now reduced to as a battle plan. Just think about that. I got the following from Martin Gilbert's The First World War, a quote that I actually used last week, but I think it's important enough that I'm going to use it again. It's from the historian.
Double dipping with your quotes. How dare you, Indy?
Alistair Horn. Quote, "Never through the ages had any great commander or strategist proposed to vanquish an enemy by gradually bleeding him to death. The macabreness, the unpleasantness of its very imagery could only have emerged from and was symptomatic of that great war where, in their callousness, leaders could regard human lives as mere corpuscles." Unquote. The total, anonymous lack of humanity of modern war. The dire situation for the British Indian Army in Mesopotamia began in late November. And if you'd like to find out more about that, you can check out that episode right here. Our Patreon.
And that was the prelude to Verdun and the road to the Somme. Great War, week 76. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.